Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Neurobiology of Trauma, What You Need to Know About the Brain and Trauma, Part 2 of 3, by Dr. Rebecca Campbell, Professor of Psychology at Michigan State University. Dr. Rebecca Campbell is a professor of psychology at Michigan State University. She holds a PhD in community psychology with a concentration in statistics, also from Michigan State University. For the past 25 years, she has been conducting community-based research on violence against women and children with an emphasis on sexual assault. Dr. Campbell's research examines how contact with the legal and medical systems affects adults, adolescents, and pediatric victims' psychological and physical health. Most recently, she was the lead researcher for the National Institute of Justice-funded Detroit Sexual Assault Kit Action Research Project, which was a 4-year multidisciplinary study of Detroit's untested rape kits. Dr. Campbell also conducts training for law enforcement and multidisciplinary practitioners in civilian, military, and campus community settings on the neurobiology of trauma. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Campbell.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar series. This is part 2 of our 3-part series on the neurobiology of trauma and what you need to know about the brain and about trauma. In this 3-part webinar series, what I want to be doing is showing you how research can help us connect the dots to understand what's happening in a sexual assault, how that affects victims' behavior and memory in the immediate aftermath of the assault, and what that means for cold case investigations and notifications, given that those notifications could be a year, 2 years, many years later. In the first part of the webinar, we did a basic introduction to the underlying structures and parts of the brain that are active during a major trauma, and we considered what that does for victims' behavior during the assault and in the immediate aftermath. In the second part of the webinar, we're going to review some of those key informational parts about major trauma response, and then we're going to focus on memory formation and recall during assault and in the immediate aftermath. And then I hope you'll also join us for the third part of this webinar, where we put these pieces together and talk about what the implications will be for cold case investigations and victim notifications. So let's begin with just a brief recap of what we know about the neurobiology of trauma. Again, Dr. David Jim Hopper and Dr. David Lisak did a nice way of summarizing a very complex multidisciplinary literature on the neurobiology of trauma when they wrote, "In the midst of an assault, the brain's fear circuitry takes over while other key parts are impaired or even effectively shut down. This is the brain reacting to a life-threatening situation just the way it's supposed to." In our first part of the webinar, we talked about how sexual assault is interpreted by the brain and the body as a potentially life-threatening situation. It's a tremendously invasive crime that happens on the victim's body, in the victim's body. And so the brain interprets this as a life-threatening situation. And when that happens, the fear circuitry, the parts of the brain, older evolutionary parts that are there to help keep us alive in life-threatening situations, are going to take over. And it's going to shut down the parts of our brain that we use to make everyday decisions. Those everyday decisions work fine in non-traumatic, non-life-threatening situations. But here, we need a different part of our brain to be controlling what's happening because we are in a potentially life-threatening situation. So the fear circuitry is that older part of the brain, the older underneath your cerebrum part. And these are the structures in the brain that are going to be affecting how a victim reacts to a major trauma, both in terms of their behavior and in terms of their memory recall. So we talked before about how the amygdala is going to be controlling this fear circuitry response, how the amygdala is shutting down the prefrontal cortex, the part where we make our usual day-to-day decisions, and instead the amygdala in the fear circuitry is affecting victims' behavior and victims' memories. So in this second part of the webinar series, we're picking up on that second part, the memory formation and recall. So what does research tell us about how the body processes major traumas like sexual assault and what will be the immediate aftermath of the assault in terms of what victims are able to remember about what they have experienced? Again, I want to turn to the work of Dr. Jim Hopper and Dr. David Lesak, who did a very nice summary of trying to condense, again, a very large multidisciplinary research literature into a good, succinct summary of what is happening from a memory perspective. They wrote, trauma victims may be unable to recall many important details, may be uncertain about many, may be confused about many, may recall some details inaccurately. This is the human brain working the way it was designed to work. Again, let's unpack this. This is the human brain working the way it was designed to work. So the way the human brain is designed to work in a major trauma means that the victim may be unable to recall some details, may be uncertain about them, may be confused about them, and may recall some details inaccurately. This is telling us this is normal processing of major traumatic memories. This is what we should expect. This is normal. This is typical, that victims may be unable to remember, uncertain about some details, may be confused, and may recall some information inaccurately. Now let's unpack this more and understand how and why this comes to be. Let's begin with talking a little bit about how memory works in general. Let's understand basic memory processes, and then we can apply that to understand what happens in memory processes when we are in a major life-threatening trauma such as a sexual assault. So the way memory normally works is that it matters what you're paying attention to. What we're paying attention to affects what we can remember. And I'm sure all of us can appreciate that from our regular day-to-day lives. When you're paying attention to something, you have a much better chance of remembering it. When you're not paying as much attention to something, then chances are you may not remember it. Maybe you've had a friend, a roommate, a partner, or a spouse that's talking to you and bless your heart, you're not paying attention to them, and then later on you don't remember what it was that they said. That's normal. That's how memory works. When you're paying attention to something, it increases the likelihood you're going to remember it. If you're not paying as much attention to what somebody says, what they're doing, what they're wearing, may not be as likely to remember it. So one of the things we want to really be paying attention to, pun intended, is what a victim is paying attention to during a major trauma, because what they're attending to is going to affect what they're able to remember. Now, when you're paying attention to something, then the parts of the brain that start to make memories can start encoding that information. The hippocampus is one of those structures in the limbic system that works on capturing the information of what we're attending to and can start forming a memory out of that information that we're attending to. So what we attend to affects what is encoded, what gets laid down in our brain as part of the memory, what the hippocampus captures, what that structure in our limbic system captures as important, as something we're attending to, and starts to lay down a memory of it. So we can use this sort of dot metaphor in a different way. If you think about all of these different dots that you see on the screen as different inputs coming into your brain from your five senses, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you taste, what you touch, what you smell, all kinds of information is constantly bombarding our brains with information coming in from our five senses. So in terms of what from all of these dots do we want to try to lay down as a memory, it matters what we're paying attention to. So if we're paying attention to the sensory experiences in that circle, in that crosshairs there, maybe those dots represent what you're hearing in this webinar, for example. that you are attending to my voice, these graphics, and that you're attending to this information in today's webinar is going to affect your brain's encoding of that information, that you're laying down a memory of this information, my voice, these visuals, that will help you later on be able to recall key details and information about this webinar. So again, out of all of the stimuli coming into your brain right now, what you're attending to, what you're focusing on, is cluing in your hippocampus about what details, what information, which of these dots it wants to capture and start to lay down as a memory. So that's how normal memory works. It's this process of what you're attending to helps focus and capture specific stimuli, specific input from your optic nerve, what you're seeing, from your auditory nerve, what you're hearing. And that's what drives the memory-making process. Now, furthermore, we know a little bit more about what happens during encoding. There are central details in an experience, core aspects of an experience that are more likely to be encoded because they're capturing our attention. The central things that are essential to what you're seeing, hearing, learning, experiencing in that moment. And these central details are different from what are called peripheral details. Peripheral details are what's happening around your core experience that didn't capture your attention as strongly and are less likely to be encoded or are just not encoded as strongly. So again, I'm imagining many of you sitting at your desks listening to today's webinar. Hopefully, the central details of what you're paying attention to, again, are the auditory of my voice, the visuals that you're seeing on your screen, and hopefully you're tuning out what's happening around you. Maybe your office mate or somebody across the way from you just spilled a cup of coffee. So maybe in the periphery there's a little bit of a smell of coffee, or you hear them cursing because they just spilled it all over their keyboard or a set of papers. Those are peripheral. That's not central to your understanding of what's happening in this webinar today. So our brain is constantly taking in information but also sorting it. What is central? What's core to this experience? What's peripheral? What's the stuff that's happening around it that honestly, it's not that big a deal. It's not core to me remembering this central experience. So central versus peripheral is very key in our normal memory processes, and it's going to be very key when we talk about what's happening in laying down a memory of a major trauma. So the central details are the key things that we're focusing on. The peripheral details are all those dots around the central thing. Again, we might encode them. They may not be as strongly encoded, or maybe some of those details, some of those dots simply aren't encoded because they're peripheral. They're not central to what we're attending to, where our attention is focused. So now let's talk about what happens in memory formation in a major trauma. Now that we understand the basic processes that happen in regular everyday life for making memories and sorting central and peripheral, what happens when the brain's trying to lay down a memory of a major trauma? Well, again, the amygdala, being part of the fear circuitry, is going to be controlling this process. So the hippocampus, when it's trying to take in the information and sorting out what is core and peripheral, is going to be very important for us to understand. A central detail in a major life-threatening trauma like sexual assault is central to the survival of the victim. So what a victim experiences as central, remember, central matters, it's that core experience. That's the things that they're attending to, that's the stuff that's going to be encoded more strongly. Things that the victim interprets as being central to her or his survival are central details, core details. They are often sensory-based. So sometimes what something smells like, what they hear, a particular sound, sometimes what they see, that they experience, that their brain says, this is central to survival. That is going to be key to their memory. sometimes these central details may seem, honestly, kind of small, seemingly almost insignificant. They may not seem important to others, like police, like doctors or nurses or friends or family, but to the victim, they're very central and they're very important in their memory. This, again, is in contrast to peripheral details. The peripheral details are not central to their survival. They're often context-based. What I mean by that is they're things that are happening around them. Remember how a second ago I talked about what might be a peripheral detail as you're listening to this webinar? If somebody across the way spills a cup of coffee or mutters something under their breath, that's peripheral. That's not central to what's happening in today's webinar. That's part of your context of what's happening around you while you're having your central experience. Same thing again applies here in a trauma situation. The context details are things that are happening around the victim during the traumatic event, during the sexual assault. Sometimes these are details that other people may think are really important. What was happening around? What was the scene? What time was it? All types of context details that the victim, frankly, just didn't attend to because they weren't central to survival. So let's talk about this a little bit more, and let me give you an example that will help, I think, you understand more what is central and what is peripheral. So again, if we think of these dots as all different types of sensory input of what's coming into the victim's brain, from the auditory nerve, what are they hearing, their optic nerve, what are they seeing, olfactory bulb, what are they smelling, what are they feeling, what are the physical sensations, all of this information of what's happening to them in that sexual assault is coming into the hippocampus. What they're attending to, what they're paying attention to is central. Those are the core memories, and those are things that are going to be central to their survival and things that are often sensory-based. So for many victims of sexual assault and other major traumas, their memories are going to be clearer and sharper regarding what they might have heard, what some of their sights might be, what they smelled, what they're paying attention to, what sights, sounds, and smells have captured their attention and what they're paying close attention to. They also may be paying close attention to what is a weapon or what might be used as a weapon against them. Again, that's because paying attention to that detail is affecting their survival. And what's happening around them, peripheral details, context details, may not be encoded as strongly. So things like being able to describe a physical scene, what was in the room where they were assaulted, what exact time did the assault happen, where was the place that it was happening, being able to remember the exact events in sequence, remembering the exact duration of the events. These are often peripheral details. They're not central to their survival, and victims may not have as good a memory of some of these peripheral details. So again, let's go through an example. So I talked about how central details are survival-oriented. Sights, sounds, smells, what they're paying attention to, and potential weapons. Many years ago in one of my research projects, I interviewed a survivor about the sexual assault, and they said, can you tell me what you were able to remember about this assault? And she started describing that there was a lamp. There was a lamp on the table next to where she was being assaulted. And she started describing this lamp in pretty tremendous detail. It was one of those kind of old-fashioned lamps, maybe something like your grandma might have had in her house. It was kind of ornate. The base was kind of ornate. It was heavy. It was metal. It had, sort of plumes and things, kind of a very heavy base. And it was on a marble. She kept talking about how it was on that sort of heavy marble base, real marble, faux marble, she wasn't sure, but it was this sort of heavy base and then this ornate carved metal stuff, and it had this kind of big, heavy lampshade. It was yellow, and she talked about how she, the shade of yellow. It was kind of like a yellowing, like maybe it had been a different color before, but now it was kind of faded and time and, damage, smoke, whatever, had turned it into this kind of yellowish color. She's describing this lamp in frankly exquisite detail. She is able to describe this, what sounds like an incredibly ugly lamp, in incredible detail. She can tell me about the metal carving. She can talk about the heavy marble base. She can even talk about the exact shade of yellow of the lamp. So she can remember the sights of this lamp in tremendous detail. Why was this lamp so important? Why did she have such clear details about this lamp? And when she paused, all I did to prompt her was say, can you tell me a little bit more about the lamp? And she's like, I kept thinking about how heavy it was, how big it was, and how if he, meaning the man who was sexually assaulting her, just reached out his arm, he would be able to grab this lamp, pick up this lamp, and smash her in the head. She said, all I could think about was that he could brain me with it, that he could hit her in the brain, that he could kill her with this lamp. This lamp, to her mind, was a weapon. This was a weapon. In her mind, it was the exact position. All he had to do was reach out. His arm was just the right distance to be able to grab this ugly, heavy lamp and pick it up and hit her in the head and kill her. So her mind was attending to the lamp. She kept looking at the lamp, taking in details of the lamp, looking for him to reach for it, to use this weapon against her. So she had a lot of details about this lamp because her mind is seeing this as a weapon, something that could have been used against her and kill her. Now, she's paying so much attention to the darn lamp that guess what? She doesn't have a lot of details about what the rest of the bedroom looked like, what the paint color was, what color was the blanket on the bed, what time was it. She could not remember the exact sequence of events that led up to this or what was happening at that moment. She wasn't able to tell me exactly how long the sexual assault took. These are peripheral. These were not things that were going to help her survive. These were not things that were going to help her recognize a potentially life-threatening situation on top of the potentially life-threatening situation that she was already experiencing. But I want us to take a moment here and look at this slide, and I want us to think about what does the standard, typical police report look like? What are the information fields that we often see in police reports? For that matter, I want us to stop and think about what does the paperwork for a medical forensic exam look like? What is the paperwork that doctors and nurses fill out about their sexual assault patients? What kind of information do police and doctors and nurses collect or expect to collect from their victims? It's often this kind of information. What time did it happen? Where did it happen? What did the victim say happened? How long did it happen? These peripheral details are often some of the first things that appear on the paperwork that police and doctors and nurses fill out about sexual assault. But these details are not central to most victims. These are not the things that they're going to remember most clearly, most quickly, with the most detail. These may be things that are important for other aspects of trying to establish the crime. They're certainly key important things that police need to find out, but these may not be the first things that victims recall. These may not be the things that they remember the most clearly. So we have kind of a problem here where what we know about how trauma works and how memories are laid down and how all of us who work with victims of sexual assault are trained to talk to them and what kinds of information we expect to collect from them and what we have to fill out in our paperwork. There's a bit of a mismatch here between what they're most likely to be able to recall and the types of questions that we're often cued to ask them. So when victims are trying to recall traumatic memories, their memory is not going to be organized in a linear sequence. It's going to be fragmented. This process of some things being central and highly attended to and some things being peripheral means that the memory doesn't go down in a nice linear sequence. Some details take more precedent than others. Some are more easily recalled than others. So the story isn't going to come out in a nice, neat, orderly fashion. You might get a very long soliloquy like I got in that interview about what a lamp looks like, and maybe not as much detail about the exact time and sequence that something happens. That's normal. That's typical. That's the way traumatic memories are laid down. The other thing that we know from research about trauma and memory is that some details are missing. We talked about that earlier in the webinar. Their memories are going to be incomplete. Some details are missing. Why? Well, maybe the detail that you want to ask about, or an information field that you need to fill out in your report, to the victim's mind was peripheral. Hey, it might be central to you. You might be like, oh, wow, I really need that detail for this report. Doesn't matter. The point of view that matters here is the victim and the victim's brain and how the victim's brain captured what was central and what was peripheral. So what is peripheral, remember, is not going to be encoded as strongly, may not be encoded at all. So one reason why certain memories are going to be incomplete is because the details were peripheral to the victim at the time of the assault. And again, those peripheral details might be things like physical scene, time, place, remembering events in sequence, and remembering the exact duration of an event. Now, another reason why a victim's memory might be incomplete was whether he or she was under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time of the assault, because that's what alcohol and drugs, many drugs do, is they impair your brain's ability to encode information. So the pool of available dots, so to speak, is already reduced because of alcohol or drug use. So what the brain might be able to capture is different because the victim is under the influence of drug or alcohol. So we have kind of two problems happening here. The alcohol is affecting memory processes anyway, and then the trauma experience while under the influence of alcohol is also influencing memory processes, meaning that they just may not be able to remember as much information. Now, a memory may also be incomplete because the victim can't find that information right now. At that moment that you're asking them, they may not be able to recall that detail right there. And it may be because they're stressed, it may be because they're asleep, it may be because they don't feel comfortable in trusting you yet. But it's something that they might actually be able to remember. They just might not be able to recall it at that exact moment. And again, I think we can all appreciate that from our regular everyday life and way memory works in normal everyday life, that sometimes you don't remember everything at that exact moment, but you give it a second, you give your brain a chance to think, you walk away and you do something else, and then that information comes back to you. Same thing happens in a major trauma, particularly for those peripheral details. They can't find it at that exact moment, but give them a little time and space and they might be able to remember it. Now finally, a memory might be incomplete and some details may be missing, or rather may appear to be missing because the victim is withholding that information. So they do know it, but they just don't want to tell you. So that they know the answer, but they're embarrassed. They feel ashamed. Again, they don't trust you. So what appears to be an incomplete memory of the fact that they're just not they're not answering, or they say, I don't know, and it appears to be incomplete, but actually they do remember. But it may take a little time to establish rapport and trust with them so that they feel comfortable sharing that information with you, because that information to them is embarrassing. It's something that they don't want to share with you, and they're ashamed. We also talked about how sometimes the details may be recalled incorrectly. Peripheral details, in particular, could be recalled incorrectly. Why is that? Well, one reason why that is that they're just filled in by victims in an unconscious process. There's no malintent here. There's no intent of lying. We'll talk about lying in a few minutes. But right now, this particular scenario that I'm talking about is a victim is asked a question they don't know, it's like a blank, and they just fill in a detail. They just blurt out an answer. Again, that happens to all of us in regular, normal memory processes and recall. You don't know, and it's not that you decide to give somebody incorrect information. Your brain takes what information it has, it pieces together an answer that may or may not be correct, and it just fills it in and blurt comes out of your mouth. There's your answer. So it's an unconscious process. Again, not trying to deceive, it's just what happens. We fill in details, and we try to remember things as best we can. It turns out we might remember them incorrectly, though. This can be exacerbated when victims feel pressured to answer. When they feel like they have to have an answer, it's more likely that their brain is going to start filling in information. They're nervous, they're going to give an answer, and that answer might be incorrect. Now, the other type of incorrect answer that they could give is a lie, where they answer and the answer that they give is not truthful. A couple key things to keep in mind of what we know about lying in the context of sexual assault victims and sexual assault recall. The part of the brain that would affect lying behavior is the executive function area. It is the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that we talked about before is right behind your forehead. It helps you make decisions. Sometimes it gives you the decision to lie, to give incorrect information, to give false details. Remember, this part of the brain is not functioning optimally in a major trauma. And so the part of the brain that might also be able to say, don't do this, don't lie, it's not a good idea to lie about this detail, is not functioning properly either. But what we want to really emphasize is that it is unlikely that victims are lying about the whole assault. Only 2 to 8% of the reports made to police of sexual assault are indeed false, meaning what happened didn't happen, meaning that the account of the assault is untrue. There was no rape. There was no sexual assault. Only 2 to 8% of the time is that the case. What may happen, though, is that victims may lie about small details. They may lie about details that they're embarrassed about, that they're ashamed about. Very few victims fabricate assault, but some victims will lie about small details. So again, what we want to understand is how that happens, why that happens, but keep in mind the central memories are stable and accurate. Peripheral details are often accurate, but sometimes for some details, particularly when victims feel ashamed of them, they might lie about those specific details. And again, we want to be mindful of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as that old expression talks about, that the whole assault very likely did indeed happen. That's what research would tell us about false reports and the fact that they're very rare, but maybe a detail along the way they haven't been truthful about. So this obviously has huge implications for how we interview victims, because clearly it's going to be important for us to establish trust and rapport with victims so that they feel comfortable, so that they feel relaxed, so that when they come to those embarrassing details, they don't withhold them. They don't lie about them. They feel comfortable telling us that, yeah, they might have had too much to drink, or yeah, they flirted with somebody. Whatever the detail is that they may feel embarrassed or ashamed about, that they feel comfortable telling us. So huge implications for victims. Now, it's beyond the scope of what I can do in today's webinar to talk about how to do trauma-informed interviewing, but here's a couple of key tips that might be useful for you. When you're interviewing victims of sexual assault, it can be helpful to use very open-ended, neutral questions, like this one. Can you help me understand what you're able to remember about your experience? It's a very open, neutral question. It's kind. It's gentle. Can you help me? Can you help me understand what you're able to remember about your experience? It helps communicate to victims that you know that they might not be able to remember every single detail. And tell us what you're able to remember about your experience. And when you say your experience, it's a very neutral word and it allows victims to pick up whatever part of the experience they want to talk about. And again, going back to that example I gave you earlier in the webinar, the victim I interviewed started telling me about that ugly lamp. The ugly lamp that was central to her experience. And it was essentially the gateway into her remembering more and more details. So it's a very nice, open, neutral question. And when victims start to stall or they start, going quiet, you can gently prompt them with, can you tell me more about that? So I asked the victim, can you tell me more about the lamp? And it's a good way of gently nudging them to sort of help them move along in talking about the memory and talking about the other details that come forward. There's more resources on trauma-informed interviewing at End Violence Against Women International's website, and I encourage all of you to go take a look and to learn more about how to take these specific ideas and put them into practice. But bringing things together for today's webinar, what are some key take-home points? What are some key summary things we've learned about trauma and memory? Again, victims are in survival mode. The brain is shutting down the conscious control. It's not functioning properly. The fear circuitry is taking over, and the fear circuitry is affecting how the memory is going to be laid down. What is central versus peripheral varies victim to victim, assault to assault. Again, what we might think is central, not necessarily what the victim thinks is central. Details that to us might seem really central, really critical to our paperwork, and frankly, really critical to proving a case in court, might be peripheral to that victim in the moment of the assault. We don't control what's central and peripheral. The victim doesn't control what's central and peripheral. What is central details are the central things that they're paying attention to that are affecting their survival. The memories for those are going to be stronger. Peripheral details they'll still have, just maybe not quite in as much detail, maybe not remember quite as strongly. So there are reasons why victims' stories are fragmented, why they're scattered, why specific details might turn out to be incorrect. We want to reevaluate these things through a neurobiological lens. Because a victim may not be able to remember the exact times, or the times that they give might later, turn out to be a bit off, doesn't necessarily mean that a sexual assault didn't happen. It meant that paying attention to the exact time and sequence that things were happening was not a central detail to the victim at the time of the life-threatening trauma, and so their memories are just frankly not as good for those details. This makes sense through a neurobiological lens. And again, why is it important for all of us who work with victims of trauma to understand these underlying processes regarding memory? It's because when we question victims, we need to be mindful how the memory was laid down is going to affect how they're able to recall it. So this is a quote from a survivor I interviewed describing what it was like being interviewed by a police officer who honestly didn't understand the neurobiology of trauma. And she described what happened in this interview like this. She said he wouldn't let up. He kept pounding me with question after question after question, trying to trick me, trying to get me to mess up. I wanted to say, hold on, give me a minute to think. No, he kept coming at me. He had been trained to do rapid fire, lots of questions, lots of details, going for lots of little details, peripheral details, and she couldn't remember all of them. And she just wanted to say to him, hold on, give me a minute to think. But he kept coming at her, question after question after question, and it wasn't helping. She wasn't able to give him a really good, clear, sustained description of what happened to her. When you do understand the neurobiology of trauma, you interview differently. This is actually from the exact same case. This is where the victim was then interviewed by a different detective, not the one you saw in the prior quote, a different detective who took a totally different approach with interviewing. And the way she described what happened was like this. He offered me a cup of coffee. Coffee? Okay, fine. How do I take it? What? Why does he care how I take my coffee? Well, he did. He made me coffee. He gave me time to just sit and collect my thoughts. See how different this is? Calming, helping establish trust and rapport, giving her a cup of coffee, making the time and effort to find out how she takes her coffee. Does she take cream? Does she take sugar? Of really trying to help her calm down and establish some trust and rapport. and giving her time to collect her thoughts. It's not an organized, it's not an organized system in there. It's going to take her some time and effort to sort of piece this together. She described what this was like as such. She said, "We talked it through, and I didn't feel rattled and freaked out, and I'm sure it was incoherent. He just let it roll. He was patient. I felt like I was piecing it together, like a puzzle. We were putting together a puzzle and drinking coffee." Again, a very different interview experience for her, and this detective is getting much, much more detailed, rich information. He's being patient. He's letting her jump around in whatever order she wants. As she talks about what is central to her, he's not interrupting. He's just letting her talk. And then as the peripheral pieces start to come in, the puzzle starts to take shape, and it starts to become clearer and clearer to her and to this detective what happened in that assault. So taken together, I hope this gives you a good feel for what happens in memory normally and what happens in memory in a major trauma. And again, this is going to have clear implications for how we work with victims at the time of their immediate report, and it's going to have implications for all of these older cases that we're working with that had previously untested rape kits. So I hope you will join us for the third part of the webinar, where we're going to glue all of these pieces together and talk about behavior and memory and what does that mean for cold case investigations and victim notifications.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for taking the time to present with us today on the neurobiology of trauma, what you need to know about the brain and trauma. Again, we would like to thank everyone for attending today, and we hope that you found today's webinar very useful and informative. Please stay tuned for the release of Part 3 in this 3-part series. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great rest of the day.